Hello and welcome to our final lesson on from chapter 2. It's lesson 4 on rights, the relationship between rights and ethics. And you will find this information on page 72 through 86 in your textbook. Let's get started. So before we begin, we have a warm-up. This will be done in class. It's a discussion on PowerSchool. If you're watching this because you're going to be absent for Kairos, just make sure you're excused from the assignment. You can email me if I forget to excuse you at the time. Email me and just remind me you weren't in class. But what the students will be doing is answering the question, how would you define rights? In other words, what is a right? Where do they come from? And what would you say are the basic human rights? So you're going to respond to those 3 bullet points in a discussion because defining rights is going to be one of our objectives. Another learning objective will be to define where they come from and to discuss competing theories of rights and their connection to morality and ethics. So what is a right? Your textbook kind of discusses different ideas to start off with. On page 74, they kind of come up with the idea that rights have 2 major elements. And the first one is having an activity or area of one's life protected against outside interference. So for example, we'll say we have the right to free speech. Perhaps you have the right to spend your money the way you want, or maybe you have a right to an abortion and the government can't interfere with that right. Another aspect of rights is that it's having a claim to another person or society as a whole to deliver a particular service or facilitate an activity. So for example, the right to a public education. That means that the government has to provide this service for you, or even the right to vote. We have a right to choose our leaders in the United States in a representative democracy, but that means the government does have to facilitate that right. So other examples might be a right to health care and things of that nature, where it's not just having autonomy to do what you want, but that you have a right to a basic level of services. When we're thinking about rights, we tend to think about them in terms of legal rights. So for example, we have the Bill of Rights in the Constitution. And so oftentimes when we talk about rights, this is where we're getting into the question of ethics, what is legal, what is ethical, and what is moral. So for example, the Bill of Rights protects, some basic rights like freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion. But what about other ways we use the term rights? So for example, if you found out that your best friend's boyfriend was cheating on her, and you're trying to decide, should I tell her, should I not? You might think to yourself, well, she has a right to know. So in that case, the term right is being used a little more broadly and specifically in a moral way, that she has a moral right to know. It's not that she has a legal right. So there is some overlap when we look at the language of rights that takes it beyond just what's legal and illegal and has a moral element to it as well. So that's why we're bringing into the discussion of ethics today. So let's take a look at some different theories that talk about rights, especially where they come from. So we're beginning with John Locke. He's probably familiar to all of you from your American history classes. His ideas were very fundamental to the American understanding of that comes out of the Constitution. So ultimately, the ground or the source of rights, according to Locke, was God and the laws of nature. So he argued that we're endowed with certain rights from God, and those included life, liberty, and the pursuit of private property. And so ultimately his logic was the idea that according to the laws of nature and God, all human beings are basically the same. Now, we all have, we may not be all the same level of intelligence, or we may end up having different social status, but the general, idea is we're all created equal in the state of nature, and no one has the right to control another. So in his understanding of rights, it's grounded in the authority of God and the laws of nature. And ultimately, he also believed in the right of private property. So as you guys already know, in the Constitution, where it says life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, or was that in the Declaration? In any case, the pursuit of happiness means private property. And so if you're looking at John Locke's idea of rights being grounded in God or the laws of nature, that might make you think that, well, if the earth is a gift to us and ultimately belongs to God, doesn't that mean we all have to share it equally? Locke says no. The reason why we have this property right is because human persons, if you have like a plot of land, you have this piece of land that ultimately doesn't really have any value until the farmer plants his seeds in it. The cow doesn't have any real value until it's domesticated. That looks like a reindeer. And used for a purpose by human beings. So he thought that by putting labor into the raw materials of the earth, that was what gave it value. And that is where the right to private property comes from. So obviously for us as Americans, this is something that is fundamental to our understanding of rights and our, understanding of respecting even rights to private property. So this is one theory of rights. Let's take a look at another one. Okay, another theory of rights they have in your book is Tom Regan's theory of rights. It's really interesting. Ultimately, Tom Regan made the argument that the source or ground of rights is in experiencing subjects of life. So what Regan is arguing here is really interesting. Somebody like Kant argued that people have value because of we're rational. Aristotle also said, hey, look, we're rational beings. We have a will. We can control our actions in the way animals can't. And that's what gives humanity their dignity. John Locke argued that the dignity of humanity came from God. So different philosophers have different ideas of where our dignity comes from. And sometimes that dignity is what ensures our rights. But Tom Regan argued that the mere ability to experience life, conscious, desiring, feeling being, is the ground of rights, not reason. And he says it cannot base rights on any other condition. And this is what he argues on page 78. I'm going to read it to you. I think it's really interesting. He says, let me find it. So he says, that all people have the same inherent value and the same rights. He says the genius and the retarded child, the prince and the pauper, the brain surgeon and the fruit vendor, Mother Teresa and the most unscrupulous used car salesman all have inherent value, all possess it equally, and all have an equal right to be treated with respect, to be treated in ways that do not reduce them to the status of things as if they existed as resources for others. So most of us would agree with this. So Regan asks, So Regan asks, what do all of the people in his list have in common? It can't be reason or intelligence, for in that case, a genius would be more valuable than the retarded child. It can't be strength of character, because in that case, Mother Teresa would be more valuable than like the unscrupulous car salesman. So he says at the bottom, what ties all of these inherently value rights bearing people together is the fact that they are all experiencing subjects of life. So all of them are conscious beings who have preferences, interests, beliefs, and desires. So ultimately, that leads Regan to the conclusion that that definition also fits animals. So he argues that no experiencing subject of life should be treated as an object. So animals should have the same rights that people do. And so he was a proponent for animal rights. He called for the abolition of animals in science, the total abolition of commercial animal agriculture, and the elimination of commercial and sports hunting and trapping. So his theory of rights led to a certain ethical and moral a more ethical and moral quest to better the treatment of animals. So once again, his theory of rights had an influence on his not just his political, not just like his theories, but also to changes in behavior. And that's where the kind of the realm of morality is. It asks, what should I do or should I not do? So I think that was kind of an interesting theory that your book had. Now we're going to take a look at John Rawls. John Rawls was a Harvard professor, and he was very much touched by, he was born in 1921 and died in 2003, and so he lived through the Second World War, and it had a profound effect on him. Classical liberalism, this idea that after the Enlightenment we have reason alone, we can solve our problems through democracy. Well, the 20th century showed that it just didn't work. And so John Rawls was on this quest for how can we make a truly just society, and he saw basic rights arising from the social contract. So in a book called A Theory of Justice, he puts forth his theory of how to make a just society. So we have a little film clip we're going to watch real quick, and then we'll talk about it. All right, so this is just a summary of John Rawls' thought experiment. He thought this was the way you could figure out how to have a truly just society. So take a look.
Veil of ignorance. All people are biased by their situations, so how can people agree on a social contract to govern how the world should work? Philosopher John Rawls suggests that we should imagine we sit behind a veil of ignorance that keeps us from knowing who we are and identifying with our personal circumstances. By being ignorant of our circumstances, we can more objectively consider how societies should operate. Two primary principles support Rawls' veil of ignorance: the liberty principle and the difference principle. According to the liberty principle, the social contract should try to ensure that everyone enjoys the maximum liberty possible, without intruding upon the freedom of others. According to the difference principle, the social contract should guarantee that everyone has an equal opportunity to prosper. In other words, if there are any social or economic differences in the social contract, they should help those who are the worst off. And any advantages in the contract should be available to everyone. So, according to Rawls, approaching tough issues through a veil of ignorance and applying these principles can help us decide more fairly how the rules of society should be structured. And fairness, as Rawls and many others believe, is the essence of justice.
Okay. So let's kind of talk a little bit about Rawls' idea. Okay, so the first thing you might notice about Rawls' idea of the veil of ignorance is that it sounds a lot like the benevolent spectator of the utilitarian philosophy. So in this case, the veil of ignorance is the idea that it goes like one step further, because the benevolent sort of spectator in Mill's scenario would try to do the common good, and the idea was you were supposed to try to, do what's best for everybody, not just yourself. But Rawls says you can't know the social status, race, intelligence of anybody, not even yourself. Now, obviously, whether or not this is actually something that's possible is not the question. Thought experiments are supposed to help us think about ethical dilemmas. So again, there were two principles that would come as a result of his thought experiment, and this is on page 80 in your text. So this is the first principle, and that was the idea. This principle was the idea that basically everybody would have the right to do whatever they would chose, provided it doesn't interfere with other people's ability to do what they want. So basically, in most Americans, kind of that's the way they view rights. As long as I'm not bothering anybody else, I should be able to do what I want. And so this is very similar to kind of a general American idea. But then in terms of the social economic system, there was the second principle. And he said ultimately that social and economic inequalities would be arranged so that the greatest benefit went to the least advantaged. Because again, you're supposed to be under a veil of ignorance. You don't know if you're completely poor or completely rich. So if you were the poor person, that's how you would want it, right? And so then the second part of the second principle is that offices and positions will be open to all under fair and equal opportunity, so that everyone would have the same opportunity to either be a trash man if they wanted to be, or to be the president or a doctor. Now, what's kind of interesting about John Rawls' theory is this: if everybody has equal opportunity, that might make you wonder, well, would that mean that everyone's like a communist or a socialist? And would there, be social inequalities? Well, Rawls actually argues that some social inequalities benefit all. So some social inequality. Whoops, what happened here? QA. It's not. What happened? Well, I'm trying to write, but it's not letting me. So he argued some social inequalities would be to the benefit of everyone. For example, as long as everyone has the option to become a doctor, that under the veil of ignorance, and they agree that ultimately it's best for society that doctors get paid more than, say, trash men, reality is that not everybody has the brains to be a doctor. So as long as everyone agrees to it at the start of the social contract, it would benefit society that doctors would get paid more. So that, because obviously it's harder to be a doctor than to be, a trash man, or a teacher for that matter. So he thought that those in lower social classes would ultimately agree to inequality, because it would bring about in order to participate in a just society. So again, it's an interesting theory. It's sort of utilitarian a bit in its outlook. But that was John Rawls' idea of how you get to a just society. Okay, so what are we as Catholics to make all of this? Well, one thing that we're going to be looking at, and I don't know why I was going to write something here, but the writing, it's not allowing me to write right now, but the language of rights sometimes gets used in Catholic discussions as well. So as Catholics, they use rights language in the Catechism. CCC stands for Catechism of the Catholic Church. So this gets used by the Church itself. Now, of course, we see rights coming as from God, not the government. But it also helps to kind of oppose utilitarianism, where people would be used sort of as a means to an end. So we would argue that all humans have the right to life, even the preborn. But that raises another question: what do we do with competing rights? What if all humans have the right to life, and then some are going to argue you have the right to an abortion. That's where ethics comes in. How do you define the more important right when you're talking about competing rights? So the church, another thing to point out, and is that we also would argue we have other basic human rights. In your book, they talk about how good Pope St. John the 23rd wrote in Possum et Terris, his 1963 encyclical, that every man has a right to life, bodily integrity, and to means which are necessary and suitable for proper development of life. And he lists food, clothing, shelter, rest, medical care, and finally necessary social services. He writes, therefore, a human being also has the right to security in cases of sickness, inability to work, widowhood, old age, unemployment, or in any other case in which he is deprived of the means of subsistence through no fault of his own. So obviously this makes clear that respecting the rights of others also means making sure that we take steps to guarantee people's basic needs beyond merely just having like the right to free speech. So we do use rights language in Catholic discourse. Some of the issues that are pointed out in the book is they talk about Mary Ann Glendon. This is a hyperlink here. I have a video of her talking about the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. She was our the United States representative to the Vatican, I believe, to the Holy See. And one of the things she's pointed out in her writing, she's a Harvard professor, she's a great scholar, is she argues that the rise of rights language has not seen also a rise in the idea of responsibility. So we keep talking about all these rights we have, but we're not talking about our responsibility. And she also points out that the language of rights neglects the social dimension of human life. Because a lot of times when people talk about rights, it's almost like we're all these autonomous individuals that are kind of living, that are with no significant association for each other. But that's just not how humans live. We're actually highly, highly social creatures. So it kind of ignores the importance of that we're not just engaging in these essential contracts. We're in relationship with each other, and what does that mean in terms of our responsibility to one another? So she gives the example of the fact that there are almost no Good Samaritan laws in the United States. And in her book, she quotes one judge who cites so far as to lay out the following scenario and make the following claim. This is on page 83. I see my neighbor's 2-year-old babe in a dangerous proximity to machinery of his windmill in his yard, and easily might, but do not rescue him. I am not liable in damages to this child for his injuries, because the child and I are strangers, and I am under no obligation to protect him. So again, this is kind of making the point that not just about law or morality, but about, what does it mean to live in a civilized society? Like, okay, maybe you shouldn't be held legally responsible, or should you? If you see a kid who's about to walk off a bridge and you can grab him, is it enough to say like, well, it's not my responsibility? You can't hold me liable for damages. And the question that she's kind of asking, don't we have a responsibility, to help each other? And it's an interesting question. Again, this is just to get you thinking. We will come look at this language of rights again when we look at, say, the right to life, and the contrasting right to an abortion. So what Ians are going to do now is think, pair, share. So first, look up the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. What points do you think are essential? Which do you think are not universal human rights, if any? So look up this document, and then first look at it yourself, then get with a partner and discuss your different answers. And then finally, we'll discuss it as a large group. So this brings us to the conclusion of chapter 2. And so we're going to do a final assessment. So originally, I think I was going to call it classwork 10, and it was going to be a paragraph. But I think, well, I'll stick to that since we had kids on Kairos. But it'll be called classwork 10. And I'm sorry, I'm trying to write on this thing right now, but it's just not letting me. So that will be on PowerSchool for you. And if you're on retreat, you can make it up when you get back. If you have any questions, just email me. Thank you.